Hi, hello, welcome back. It's me, Dev Raj, and this is just to introduce a new series of occasional videos I'm going to make about books. Because, even though I've spent like over a decade working really in the field of body-based therapy and Reichian stuff, bioenergetics, I've never read Wilhelm Reich. I've read some Alexander Lowen books, and there's an assortment of other books that I've never really read. And I was reading about this thing they do in America called continuous professional development, where you have to always be upgrading yourself a little bit, and you get some tax breaks or something like that. I don't get any tax breaks, but I thought hey, I'm going to read some of these books. I'm just going to set myself a basic challenge, like 10, 15 pages a day, and just work my way through some books. And the first book I picked on is a book called New Wings for Daedalus by Francis Regardie. I think I heard about this book originally from Nick Farcher at New Falcon Press in the US, and I will leave a link to where you can buy it either as a paperback or as a download. I had a download, I'd love to show you a kind of copy, but I didn't buy a physical version. I just read the EPUB version. The first thing that intrigued me about this book, and it was quite an aha moment, was actually its writer. Because like a few decades ago, actually before I got into therapy, I was briefly into a thing called Kabbalah and Western mystery tradition, these kind of Western magical traditions. I did like a year or two of studying that scene with a group called Builders of the Adytum based out of Los Angeles, I think. But it was like a correspondence course. I was living in London at the time. And to anyone who's ever been, involved in this scene in the West, there's one big name, and that name is Israel Regardie, who was a former assistant of a somewhat controversial British character called Aleister Crowley. And then he went on to write an awful lot of books about the Western mystery tradition, about the Golden Dawn in America and London and these kind of things. And so he's like one of the leading writers, this guy, Israel Regardie. So when I saw the name Regardie on this book, I thought, well, surely it's not the same guy, is it, writing about Reichian therapy? But I checked inside the cover, and yes, his original name was actually Israel Francis Regardie. Could have been Francis Israel Regardie. I think it was Israel Francis Regardie. So it was the same guy. So, I previously believed that my interest in Kabbalah, which only really happened for a couple of years, and then my interest in therapy, which is more like a 20-year thing, that these were kind of separate interests and there wasn't much pulling them together. But then I find this other guy, Israel Regardie, has been prominent in both of these fields. So I was like, wow, this is like quite an aha moment. And then I read a little bit more about Regardie's background and found out that despite being British, he'd moved to the States and I think lived in Los Angeles for the greater part of his life. And although he wrote a lot about the Western mystery traditions and magical stuff, his day-to-day job was as a psychiatrist. And he specialized in his own version, essentially, of Reichian therapy. Now, he didn't learn directly from Wilhelm Reich, but I believe through a chap called Paul Kirkorano, or a name very similar to that. And then for those of you who are interested in this field, it was through Kirkorano and Regardie that Jack Willis came to write his book called The Reich Homebook, which is some 500, 600 pages and available for free on a PDF. And this, of course, if you're in this field, is actually the primary written resource about Reichian therapy that really includes a lot of detail about actual techniques that Reich was using. So this was kind of interesting to my mind, that the lineage becomes a bit clear. You've got Reich, Kirkorano, who studied with Reich, Francis Regardie, who studied with Kirkorano for 3 years, I believe, and then that information, I think Willis learned from Regardie, and Willis eventually wrote down a lot of these techniques. So back to New Wings for Daedalus and the book itself. Regardie begins with some chapters discussing Reich himself. And as many therapist writers do, he creates a bit of separation between Reich the therapist and psychiatrist and Reich, who was a kind of new kind of scientist, which was a study that dominated the latter part of Reich's time, particularly when he was in the States. And a lot of people who are into Reichian therapy, for various reasons, do tend to create quite a distinction because they don't really want to be associated with some of Reich's later work, which I can understand on, bearing in mind the culture of the time. Regardie's writing is quite intellectual, theoretical. He uses a lot of kind of words that would have been prominent in psychiatry back in the middle of the last century. And so it's not like a super easy to read book if you don't have any kind of background in psychology. But once he's discussed a little bit the history of Reich and some of his overall ideas, Regardie does provide really quite a deep written introduction to vegetotherapy, which is really the original name that Reich chose for his therapy, of how to pump up energy in the body and then use different techniques to release these rings of muscular armor that are around the body. And whilst there aren't any illustrations, and it's clearly not Regardie's intention to provide a kind of user manual for Reichian therapy, he does discuss quite a lot the different techniques that he developed, and he talks about his experience working with clients for some 30 years or so, and the kind of things that they go through and the things that he's learned. And it is a really, really interesting book. At times, like I say, it's a little bit heavy. It's been written quite a long time ago. It's aimed at a more psychiatric or clinical psychological audience, but it's still got a lot of useful info in there. And I found myself writing down quite a few exercises from this book, to experiment and try with myself. So I do really recommend this book if you're serious about studying Reich's work and overall this whole field of body-based therapy. I think it is a very good book. It only costs about $10 from New Falcon, and I have no hesitation in thoroughly recommending it. I think anyone who's really interested in this field, and particularly if they want to work as a therapist in this field, would get a lot from it. Okay, cool. Thanks very much. I'll leave a link to this book below. And my next review is planned to be of Wilhelm Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism, which I think has the distinction of being the only book that's actually been burned by the Nazis, the Americans, and quite possibly the communists. I'm not sure if the communists actually burned it. They certainly banned it. Anyway, I'll be back with that in a few weeks' time, and thank you very much for tuning in.